Now, as a neurosurgeon, I do think my engineering helped me. You work through it because you know the positive outweighs the negative. I have to have some kind of a buy-in that I really believe in this idea.
Welcome to EGR Pod, where engineers tell their stories. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Emanuela Binello, who has a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD in nuclear engineering from MIT, and an MD, PhD from Harvard and MIT. Thank you for being with us today, Emanuela.
Thank you for having me.
You have a very exciting job right now, and you started out as an engineer, so I'm curious to hear about why you chose engineering in the first place.
I first got to MIT and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I was a little bit debating between brain and cognitive sciences or maybe physics or mechanical or something. I wasn't quite sure. And then I went to an open house hosted by the nuclear engineering department, which I thought was really interesting. And we were taking 802 electromagnetism, which I thought was super interesting. Somehow those four Maxwell's equations really captured my attention. And I just decided that I was going to do nuclear engineering. But I always had a little bit of more of a radiation science bent to it rather than thinking I was going to work in a power plant, which is one of the subspecialties of nuclear engineering. So I did go into it with a specific subspecialty interest within the field of nuclear engineering.
And you had an interest in some sort of biological things prior.
Yes.
So even at that time, you realized that there was some way to meld these two things.
Correct.
And so what were the undergraduate years like?
Well, the beginning really stands out because it was such a transition where you go from being one of the smartest kids in the class in your high school, and then you get to MIT and you are no longer effortlessly one of the smartest kids in the class because everyone's the smartest kid in their class. And then all of a sudden you have to really recalibrate your whole effort, your whole, place in the world. And that was a real challenge to adjust to, especially at the beginning. It took a while. Once I got going, I felt better. I think the other difficult thing in any bachelor's is that first year were all the basic math, physics, and chemistry. And everyone has very different levels of experience starting out. And the playing field is not level. So you're going to have people study nothing and get good grades, and the people have to study a lot. And then I felt like once I entered my engineering classes, then the playing field was much more level because no one had ever seen those engineering classes before. And that's when I finally started doing better. And I felt more confident in what it is that I was doing. So that's from just the engineering perspective. And then at the same time at MIT, we have to do a humanities concentration. And then, I was like, well, with 2 more classes, I could just do a minor. And then, with another 3 or 4 classes plus a thesis, I could just get a major. And I just kind of got caught up one thing with another. And then I ended up getting a second bachelor's degree at the same time as my nuclear engineering bachelor's, and my second one was in Russian studies. So that was a little bit of like one thing leading to another, and it made for a very, very intense senior year. It went kind of the opposite of most people. I did not have senioritis. I was just trying to cross that finish line because I got a little too much on my plate. So I went all out and I got it done, but it actually taught me the opposite of senioritis, which that when you really focus, you can really get a lot done. So it was somewhat actually very formative for the rest of my educational career and professional career.
Yeah, so you ramped up.
Yes, I ramped up because all of a sudden I had to get all those courses done for that second bachelor's degree. And I was determined to graduate with my class. I was class of 95. I started off as class of 95, and I was going to finish as class of 95 for my bachelor's.
So determination.
That's right.
Is what got you through it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious, did you feel that what you learned in those early classes in the math and the sciences prepared you to be on that equal footing for the engineering classes? Or do you feel like if everyone had just gone straight into those engineering classes without the benefit of the foundational courses? So a person who may struggle, I guess is my question, a person who may struggle in those introductory math and science classes, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to struggle in their engineering classes?
For myself personally, I struggled in those introductory classes, and then I sailed in the engineering classes because I just had not focused on as much math and chemistry and physics in high school as maybe other kids had. I was a little bit more of a classics, Latin, history, Greek. I mean, all sorts of very classic things. And not that I was ever bad in math and science at high school. I just didn't take the advanced classes that a lot of other people had taken. So I struggled more. But I think in some ways it was better for me to struggle and buckle down early on, because then when I figured out I had to really study and figure out what was going on, then I developed a different kind of approach and discipline to classes in general. And I think that helped me later. And I feel like maybe some of the people who sailed through that first year because they had all that background, then they faced the first year of engineering classes. They didn't realize they have to really buckle down and study. And some of them faltered. I mean, some did fine, but some of the others faltered. So I don't think it's necessarily related.
It's individual.
Depends how you approach it. Yeah.
What was that approach you figured out? Do you have any tips from that?
No, I think it's just that you have to really understand the essence of some of these physics classes. And what I'm trying to say is, for example, for electromagnetism, just that basic class, I really struggled until I realized there was just four equations to really know. And everything at the end of the day comes from that. So then it helped me because I didn't have to remember too many things. I just had to understand four things. And then I felt better. And the other time I had this eureka moment was in our electronics class, 6071, I think. And there was that chapter on Bode plots. And all of a sudden, I just understood the Bode plot. And you could give me anything about this Bode plot, and I got the Bode. Not that I have any recollection what a Bode plot is right now. But back then, it clicked. And I somehow got some astronomically high grade on this Bode plot test. And I was never the upper echelons of electronics. But you don't always get to that level of understanding in every class. Many classes, I just stayed at the normal, you get a fine grade, but it's not like you break the curve. But there were a few times in undergrad that I was really like, okay, I got some kind of fundamental truth that clicked. And then once you get to that point, there's almost no problem that the professor can give you that you can't figure out.
You had several undergraduate research opportunities, correct? You did the Europe program.
Yes, I did.
So maybe tell us just a little bit about how you felt about the undergraduate research in terms of how it contributed to what you wanted to do in the future, or how it contributed to how you learned or your interests, or what the experience was just like in general.
Yeah, I think it was a good experience. I did my undergrad research opportunities program back then it was called the MGH NMR Center. Now it's called the Martino Center. And I was working on a project for magnetic resonance imaging in breast cancer. And it was a really good experience. I learned a lot about just kind of data analysis. I was able to see a big group of researchers and just understand that there was abstracts, conferences, just to have a general understanding. And actually, I ended up doing my bachelor's degree thesis in the same lab that I did the Europe. And it kind of grew out of my Europe project. And I was able to turn it into my bachelor's degree thesis for nuclear engineering. So that was junior year, leading to senior year. And then sophomore year, I worked in a radiation oncology lab looking at effects of radiation on cells. And interestingly, that came to be very relevant way, way later in my life. But that was also another aspect of nuclear engineering. And it helped me clarify that I really did want to stay with this more biological or radiobiological aspect of nuclear engineering, because there are three subspecialties in nuclear engineering: fission, fusion, and radiation science. Or at least at the time, it was fission, fusion, and radiation science. And I really confirmed that I did not want to do fission or fusion. I really wanted to stick with radiation science because it had a lot of different applications, from industry to medicine. So I thought it was more broad in that respect.
And at that point, did you have any inkling that you would go into the medical field and pursue an MD? Was that somewhere in the back of your mind?
I may have briefly thought about it, but not really, because I was really more focused on getting my master's and then getting my PhD in nuclear engineering. I subsequently transitioned from the magnetic resonance imaging to boron neutron capture therapy for my master's and PhD degrees in nuclear engineering. Neutron capture therapy is like a binary therapy based on the principle where a neutron absorbs boron and then gives off these alpha particles that deposit very locally and kill whatever cell they're in. That's the bottom line. And I was doing an application to rheumatoid arthritis. Again, little did I know that this would subsequently have relevance and be somewhat related to what I was going to do way later on, but I didn't know that then. And so I didn't know about being interested in medicine until I got more towards the end of graduate school in nuclear engineering, not when I was an undergrad.
And you knew from the get-go as an undergraduate that you wanted to pursue this through PhD, or did that develop over time?
Well, I started getting more interested in doing research through my bachelor's degree, thesis, and then I wanted to do a master's degree. But I really wanted to continue because I was really excited about doing projects and discovering things and going to conferences and I thought that was amazing when you go to conferences because it's like all these people from all around the world, often from countries that don't get along with each other. And yet we are all there talking about some scientific or engineering principles and we all get along. Well, I mean, of course there's disagreements within science, but discussions are not predicated upon who you are, where you're from, but it's more about the science. And there was something so appealing about that because it was like a sign there can be peace, there can be world peace. I mean, not to sound too flaky, but really, you sound like, oh, there could be world peace, but people can get along. It's okay. People from this country and that country, it's fine. They can all get along. Or this state from that state, or this part of the U.S. from with the other part of the U.S., or crossing party lines, or anything. So I thought that was such a unifying thing, and at the same time, you're discovering things that feel like maybe could be helpful someday to the world or the community at large. So there, I was really much more focused on research at that time.
Sometimes we talk to people who enjoy their jobs but don't feel that kind of inspiration, and I'm sure on a day-to-day basis maybe that inspiration doesn't occur to you,
No.
but when you reflect upon that there are people in your field, smaller subsets of people who are working on such interesting and important topics, that you're right, other things seem less consequential in those moments.
Yeah, I mean, it was no walk in the park. I certainly had my share of extreme frustrations, and anyone who's done a master's or PhD thesis, I would imagine almost anyone has had a lot of ups and downs and a lot of frustrations. No question about that. But you just keep going. You work through it because you know that positive outweighs the negative. So, I mean, at least for me, I was just driven to continue. And I have to say, for me personally, I really have to have some kind of a buy-in that I really believe in this idea. Because if I don't really believe in this idea, it's going to be hard for me personally to work on it. And that's a personal thing. Not everybody is like that. And I'm a very hard worker and I would put extremely large amount of hours in. Then I have to really believe in the promise of what I'm doing, at least in the idea.
So research, you loved research, you were doing lots of research. When did you switch over and decide, I'm going to go into medicine?
So it came about towards the end of my PhD of nuclear engineering. By then, I was doing this neutron capture therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. My subspecialty area was neutron beam design, which means I was designing moderator and reflector assemblies so that we could get a certain spectrum of neutron energies on the other side. Because the accelerator would make protons, and the protons hit a target. After the target, get neutrons on the other side of the target. Then they have to go through this moderator reflector assembly, and then they come out all the way on the other side. And there are various different people in the lab that I was in at the time that were working on the different parts of the project. So there was someone working on the target and cooling the target and all the thermodynamics associated with cooling the target. And then I was working on the moderator reflector assembly because we had to slow the neutrons down from fast to slow because they needed to be a certain energy in order for boron neutron capture therapy to work. And I was working so hard, and we were doing animal experiments and cells, and first of course the modeling, then the construction of the moderator reflector, then the testing of the moderator reflector. So all of this, and somehow along the process I realized, unless I was going to have some kind of doctor buying into this, it was really ultimately not going to go anywhere. And I was working so hard with this ideal that, oh, I was going to do this, and someday patients were going to benefit because they could have this non invasive synovectomy procedure. And then at the end of the day, it wasn't really going to happen unless you had all this buy-in from all these clinicians. And a lot of clinicians are not necessarily running to embrace new technologies. It's very hard to break into the sphere of getting things into clinical practice. And somehow, as I was starting to realize that, I was getting a little more, not disillusioned, but reality was setting in that maybe this ideal picture was not the whole picture. And as I said, for me, I have to really believe in it, totally buy into it. And I was starting to buy into it less. And then I was like, well, if I really want to bring some kind of a new technique, technology, something like that into the clinical world, I really actually need to be a clinician, because the clinicians have the patients and they're the ones guiding the boat. So that's when I started my transition to medicine.
At this point, it's marking somewhat of a move away from engineering. You did actually get the MD PhD, but the PhD, if I'm correct, was in health science technology and no longer in nuclear engineering, because you already had a PhD in that. So this sort of deviation from engineering, when you look back, or even maybe in the moment you appreciated or recognized it, what did engineering do for you? If you had tried at the outset to plan this career for yourself, are you glad you went the engineering route?
Now, as a neurosurgeon, I do think my engineering helped me. I did not think my engineering helped me when I was doing biology, specific, like molecular biology. But I understand the value of it now, only insofar as the concept of problem solving. I feel like the problem solving is more well developed, perhaps. For me, I feel like the engineering gives you that rigor of problem solving. Because, right, when you're undergrad, it's all about problem sets. I mean, I guess they called them homework assignments. We called them problem sets back then. So it was every week, every class had a problem set. It was a set of problems that you had to solve. And so I feel like I'm able to have expanded my range as a neurosurgeon because of some of that core problem solving skill set and approach that somehow I developed during all those years of engineering. And I feel like I can sometimes find creative solutions or solve problems even intraoperatively that may or may not occur. Maybe someone else who's working with me, I attribute it just because of that rigor of all those years of engineering problem solving. And I feel like that's more emphasized for us as a whole concept and drilled into us more. And I felt it was slightly less emphasized when I was doing all of my biology or immunology things.
Can you give us an example of one of those moments in neurosurgery where you have to employ that problem solving?
I actually have a great example. So I was on call and I had this spine case that came in. It was a spine trauma. This patient had fallen and had a bad fracture dislocation in her lumbar spine. And she was intact, meaning she had full strength in her leg. She was like a millimeter away from paralysis. And then all of a sudden you have to go to the operating room and you have to stabilize it. You have to reduce the fracture, which is a fancy way for lining up the fracture and reducing it. At first, it was a really unusual fracture because one vertebral body was completely over the other one. So it's a very, very rare fracture to encounter. And I think also because she might have had some scoliosis on the background. That's why she was still moving her legs. And, when I first looked at that scan, I was like, oh my. And then you just think, well, you have to fix it. And let's try to figure out how we're going to do it, because it's not like there's a plethora of things written about that specific configuration that you encounter. And sometimes you also don't have time to look up a plethora of things. And so I just kind of came up with how to do it and how to put this patient in traction and apply forces in a specific order in order to realign the spine. And so I realigned it, and this is all the mechanics, those like beam dynamics. And not that I never had a eureka moment in that class of mechanics, by the way, as an aside. But I was like, okay, well, if it's twisted like this, then we have to untwist it like that. And we have to do this, and then we do that, and we do this, and we do this, and then it lined up. And then after it was lined up, we put the hardware in. Once the fracture is lined up and reduced, then the hardware itself isn't all that complex. But when I was presenting this case at a grand rounds later on, some of my colleagues were really taken aback by the scan because, again, it's a very unusual fracture pattern. And they actually credited, it must be because of your engineering skills, you were able to figure that out. And I was like, wow, I guess it must be because it was not obvious when you first look at it how to fix that. But if you think it through logically and you're like, first you have to distract, so pull out, and then you have to pull down, and you have to rotate, and then it all kind of falls into place. I think that was one example that I feel like it was a very logical problem solving step by step that got us through the end, because I wasn't specifically following somebody's instructions or somebody's directions, because it's too unusual of a fracture for there to be like a textbook on it. I mean, you have basic principles of how you do things, but you had to kind of be a little creative to reduce it.
So you do difficult but important and exciting work. Are there things that you think you would have done differently, or do you feel like everything fell into place as it should have as you made your way to this profession?
Well, I have to say, as a neurosurgeon, I do feel like my colleagues who have started out being interested in neurosurgery know more, meaning I have to do more work still just because they've spent more time on it. So I've spent less time on it because I came to the field later. And so I had to just continue working very hard to keep my knowledge base up. And so I do wonder, it would have been easier if I would have known ultimately that I was going to be a neurosurgeon way back when, because it could have just been a little less intense. I've had a very intense life. So I feel like some people lower their intensity a little bit sooner than I have been able to lower my intensity, because then I had to do all that catch up. There are many people in my field who know somehow from a very early age that they're going to be neurosurgeons. And so then they have a huge background of knowledge that they've accumulated just by virtue of time and just being in the field and being around. And I just had to then continue working very intensely to accumulate the same or similar kind of knowledge base. And then it was really challenging for longer. So it would have been easier to maybe get a more neuro background sooner.
To perhaps an engineering student just starting out, or perhaps someone who might even have some interest in going into the medical field and is considering engineering as their bachelor's field of study, what are some tips for new students?
Try to gain exposure and try to seek out opportunities or experiences where you get a little bit of a real world view of what it is out there related to engineering. You have to do your classes, of course. But if you're interested in maybe biomedical engineering or something, then try to seek out opportunities related to that, because sometimes you can't encounter everything in the classroom. I mean, you have to have the basic engineering principles and the rigor that comes with accomplishing your engineering classes. And that's the top priority. But as you're trying to figure out, where do I want to take this? What do I want to do with this engineering degree? In your time when you're not in class, especially, try to seek out opportunities or do internships just to get exposure. Because I think that's something that you need to take your own responsibility for seeking out a little bit. And you might be surprised by what you find.
Well, thank you for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to talk with us today and share your experiences and your insights. It's always fun, and I appreciate you being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me. This was a pleasure, and I hope whoever's listening, they'll get some inspiration.
Thank you to our listeners. This podcast is produced by Nina Lord and supported by Northern Virginia Community College. For information about engineering at Nova, please visit us at nvcc.edu or on Instagram at EGR_AT_NOVA.